Welcome to the Ethical Crossroads podcast. On today's episode, we're going to talk everything Web3, so everything from NFTs to cryptocurrency and the blockchain. I'm joined today by Warren Calove, who is a project manager at a Web3 gaming company called Drip, and also the co-founder of his own NFT company called Vanities. So Warren, thanks for joining us today. Let's jump right in and talk a little bit about what Web3 is and how it kind of differs from today's concept of the internet.
All right, thanks for having me. So basically, Web3 is often referred to as the semantic web, where everything is more machine readable, there's better ontology, and a lot can be shared through metadata versus from a database. So the distributed nature of blockchain in particular opens things up to have better provenance and single sources of truth versus having to piece that from a bunch of centralized sources. So when we're comparing Web3 with Web2, we're thinking more in terms of storing things in a fixed location, single server, versus Web3, where we're storing things in multiple places simultaneously. And of course,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, of course, this kind of all originates back to Web 1, where it was just all purely static. And now there's just been kind of a nice evolution onward to Web 3.
So, for the purposes of the layman, could we describe Web 1 as being like the 1990s of the internet, where we were primarily just navigating through static HTML pages? And we're currently and have been in for the last 20 years the Web 2 environment, right? Which has really been led by big tech and been fueled by content created both by professionals and everyday people and hosted on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And Web 3 will be sort of the next evolution that includes a lot of the qualities and details that you just talked about.
Exactly. And so we're going from centralized storage to this decentralized and distributed, more of an open internet, if you will, in Web 3.
So, what's been the motivation, though, to move from Web 2 to Web 3? Like, why are we not just fine with how the internet is now in Web 2 and it's just such a large part of everyday people's lives? What's the proponent and what are proponents' goals for moving to something like Web 3?
So pretty much the main pillars of Web3 and why you want to move there are three things: self-custody, digital sovereignty, and financial freedom. So self-custody, you have complete ownership over your own assets, not beholden to some bank or other intermediary. There's often the saying, not your keys, not your crypto, or not your keys, not your wallet, where that's speaking to owning private keys to truly have control over your own assets. And so if those assets are on a centralized exchange, for instance, it's that exchange that actually owns your assets and can manipulate that. But if you have control, then you have true self-custody. So beyond that, there's digital sovereignty, and that speaks to how much control you have over your own data. So Web 2 has largely been in the business in selling your data in exchange to use their services, but oftentimes it's not an even exchange. Whereas Web 3, we're trying to give more control to the individual through a layered approach where you can reveal how little or how much you want about yourself and try and be compensated for that, actually. So there's more leeway now to have that as a possibility. And finally, there's financial freedom, and among other things, we're actually speaking towards a currency system that can eventually be devoid of any government influence. So if we're thinking about things in terms of just like the US dollar, for instance, right? And the history of that. So paper currency that originated from a man by the name of Salmon Chase, who was the Treasury Secretary of Abraham Lincoln. So he's the one who created the national banking system and the first paper currency, the first US dollar, where he put his own face on it. And it's like one man who had so much power over currency here in the States. Whereas in Web3, it's coming more from the ground up, where there needs to be a consensus around, all right, what should the currency be? What should represent us in any given transaction? And so now you're having a lot more distributed influence, and that is a form of financial freedom, in my opinion.
So you've talked about a lot of positive qualities here: sovereignty, freedom, more security, all of these qualities that are associated with Web3 and its products. But when we think about Web2, we see something that was almost centrally planned by a group of people, primarily in Silicon Valley, that came together and had a mostly common vision for what should constitute Web2. So can we say the same thing about Web3? Is it a group of people that are in concert planning around these principles that you've talked about, or is it a much more distributed, sort of democratic structure to the people that are planning what Web3 is going to look like?
Yeah, the goal is to be distributed, and the network really it speaks to that. So from a technical standpoint, it relies on different node validators to confirm transactions and then come to a consensus afterward. And a good representation of that are DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations. And so these are a group of folks who come together. They can vote, pool their resources, all for a common cause. And this is all through distributed systems, right? There's no central government or entity involved, or or main company to control any given decision in these DAOs. And so that's one embodiment of the ideals in terms of Web3 and where we want to go.
So, sort of coming off of that, when we talk about Web3, we talk about open networks where communities can dictate outcomes, rather than like a single central authority like we see in the Web2 context. Can you tell me more about how these networks function and what kinds of decisions are communities making?
Yeah. So again, it's all distributed. There's really there is like a consensus protocol, right? But a lot of this in terms of just how blockchains operate, really good ones at least, they have really good governance. And governance is all about making sure there's fair voting among token holders on how their blockchains should scale and grow, and what they should support. And so there's a proper governance system. There's a distributed treasury where the decision making of how to use those tokens doesn't come from a centralized source, but again comes through distributed decision making and a voting process. So all of that is really key to making sure that we're living up to the Web3 ideals.
So you mentioned blockchain. Can you tell me more about blockchain and why it's central to the concept of Web3?
Right. So it is the decentralized infrastructure that helps make Web3 a reality. So it is the thing that provides these node validations to confirm blocks and get your transactions through. But more than that, really, you can think of the blockchain as a public ledger where a lot of good ontology traceability can happen. You can literally see every transaction. And so that really speaks to, again, part of the ethos of also having better single sources of truth and better provenance in the Web3 space.
So despite the security that the blockchain offers, I think when most people think about Web3 and blockchain, they're thinking about cryptocurrency. That's really what's in the news. But when we hear about cryptocurrency in the news, we're often hearing negative stories. We're hearing about stories like FTX. We're hearing about the SEC's recent enforcement actions against Binance and Coinbase. So, despite these additional security measures and protocols, why are we still seeing negative stories about really the security associated with trading cryptocurrency?
So a lot of the problems around crypto have revolved around people who are still trying to do things in a very centralized way. So they want to have control over the platform. They don't want it to be distributed, and they want to have these centralized exchanges or lending protocols that are actually tra- are actually like run in a very traditional Web2 way. And so that's what happened with FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, where him and his cohorts, they were able to just control what that FTX token embodied and where everyone's assets were going. And so that kind of backdoor access has really been the problematic use of crypto. But again, that's also like a general Web2 problem. And so in many ways, they've just been bringing Web2 problems onto Web3. And more than that too, there's this whole thing of making yourself a centralized figure that takes on the spotlight and tries to be the one to control things and quote unquote save crypto. So that's SBF, that's CZ in Binance, that's Do Kwon from Terra Luna, where they over time kind of gain some sort of messiah complex, where instead of messiahs, you really need dark knights in the crypto world, where they go in, they do the right thing, and then they disappear essentially. They don't want to be seen as the like a central figure, central authority that has so like a lot of sway over the market. And so obviously the biggest example of that is Satoshi Nakamoto, the founder of Bitcoin, where once he got the Bitcoin blockchain in place and got the ecosystem going, he disappeared. He just didn't want it to be about one person or and or have that much influence over the future of Bitcoin. Same thing with Gavin Wood over at Polkadot. After he stepped down as the CEO, he said it's because like I don't want to be that central figure. That's not what Web3 is about. And so again, these are folks that are trying to embody more the distributed nature of how Web3 really should be. And that's how you can actually keep yourself out of trouble and and clamp down on the fraud, which has really been happening when people do things in a more centralized way.
I see. So despite the security measures that are offered by Web3 technologies, we're still probably likely to see compliance and ethics failures when those companies are not actually living the values of Web3, but are still sort of stuck in that Web2 operating space.
Exactly. And that's what we need to change. We might need to eventually move away from centralized exchanges. They did have their purpose in terms of helping onboard people into Web3 and introducing them to crypto through a more familiar means. But in the long term, again, it's ripe for manipulation and ripe for fraud, keeping things centralized.
So let's talk a little bit about another product of Web3, which are NFTs. And I think when people hear that word, they think of young people, probably under 25, that are spending real money on things that don't really have any value, or at least are not perceived to have value. Can you tell us a little bit more about what NFTs are and actually why they do have value?
Right. So NFTs are non-fungible, which means they are one of one. There is no other token that is the same as that NFT that you have. And the biggest use of NFTs really is proof of ownership, right? They're the ultimate digital receipt. So when they first started using NFTs, it was really to represent PFPs, personal profile pictures, different artwork, and trying to sell them as one of one. But unless you're getting the physical art mailed to you, really you're just getting a proof of ownership of that art instead. And so this is actually really good for things like IP ownership and settling that. And eventually, of course, you can have that NFT represent anything that you actually own, whether that's a deed to a house, your car title, anything in the real world. But to your point, we started with just people creating these NFT collections and having them represent different artwork, and it was more about just driving the value of those NFTs through trading and utility, and all of the marketing was revolved around just how much these NFTs can get you in terms of returns over time. But there's a lot more of the NFTs than that.
So to be clear, an NFT is like a certificate of authenticity, and what it's really doing is sort of reserving your right in one digital copy or in one copy of a digital product or a physical product in the real world, but it doesn't really give you title to the original product. So for example, digital assets are highly reproducible, right? So if I download a picture from Google right now, there could be 1,000 versions of that picture saved on 1,000 different computers. What an NFT is doing is we're sort of reserving my right in one copy of that picture.
Right. And what I tell people is if you're buying an NFT or you're buying into an NFT collection, if that NFT collection is not giving you any IP ownership, then there's not much of a point to actually buy that NFT. You're not really it's like almost an empty receipt, so to speak. They're not really giving you anything, and you're just simply at that point hoping to flip it for more money. But it's it's all about something that has to be associated with that does give you that proof of ownership. And so CryptoPunks, for example, like they have a contract associated with their NFT collection that clearly states all the IP rights that you own by owning a CryptoPunk. Same with Nakamigos as well, which is the more recent NFT collection. And so these are more valuable and will really embody what the power of NFTs really are in terms of just having some provable ownership, but they need some teeth to them, right? They need the actual like IP contract agreement tied to them. So
And NFTs have the power to create value, right? So we both come from the music world, and I think there's an artist, an EDM artist, 3Lau, who gets millions of streams per month on Spotify. But I think he was able to issue an NFT for one of his albums, which was purchased for $3 million by a listener. So NFTs also have the power to create investment, right? By an audience or a group of listeners or a group of fans in someone that they are essentially interested in or invested in emotionally and monetarily.
right. And to your point, royalties are a big deal in terms of NFT utilities. And a lot of artists have been using NFTs to distribute royalties to their fans in exchange for buying these NFTs and supporting that artist up front. And that is a huge utility for for music, at least in particular.
And I think that does a good job of explaining the value creation between Web 2 and Web 3, right? So many musicians are out there getting millions of streams a month on Spotify or Apple, and really that doesn't reflect the true value of what they've created and put out there in the world. Unless you're a Taylor Swift or a Drake, you need tens of millions of streams to really turn true revenue in the music world, at least. Whereas NFTs are giving mid-level artists and below an opportunity to also create economic value for the art that they're creating.
Right. And with traditional distribution of royalties, it's also still very much a manual process where humans are involved and they can make errors, and they can send the royalties to the wrong person, things like that. Versus Web3, they're distributed through smart contracts, which are more trustless in the sense where it's all built into the functionality of the smart contract. You don't have to rely on another person getting it right, so to speak.
So you use the word trustless here, and as I've mentioned earlier in our discussion, people have concerns about Web3 and about cryptocurrency. They're probably looking for the word trustworthy. So can you explain a little bit more about what trustless means in the Web3 context?
Yeah, so trustless essentially means you don't have to trust the other person in the agreement, but rather you just have to validate that the smart contract and the functions in them are doing what they're supposed to be doing, or they were written correctly. So I can have the most trust in like any given accountant, but eventually they can make a mistake and let me down. Whereas a smart contract will just get it right every single time and really streamline that process without having to worry about like the just any errors that can happen through two people just manually doing the same type of transactions.
So despite the value that NFTs potentially create and some of the security that they're backed up by, they just like crypto, they are somewhat ripe to ethical and compliance concerns. I think we've seen some examples with Mutant Ape Planet and OpenSea that these products are also susceptible to things like money laundering or insider trading. So again, I have to ask you, like, what can we do to better ensure that NFTs have the same level of security that's needed just for just like crypto to prevent sort of ethical risks from emerging?
Yeah. So basically, again, we have to eliminate any type of backdoors, right? Where they that's exactly what happened in OpenSea. Somebody was able to access some insider knowledge, if you will, and access those backdoor passageways to to manipulate something for their benefit. But for NFTs and to live up to the ideals of Web3, you again you have to renounce ownership first of that smart contract NFT, and make sure that it's not something that can be that the owner of the contract can still can still manipulate things in certain ways after they've already sold their collection. Mm, and also beyond that too, it's it's really it's really the community and all of these marketplaces as well, trying being more and more distributed. They can't act like a centralized platform, and that's how you clamp down on the fraud. That's how you get more accountability in the NFT space.
So Web3 is a whole different group of people, a new community, new set of entrepreneurs from the people that were likely involved in Web2 for the most part. So how can we describe or sort of evaluate how open this very, of course, diverse group of people are to things like compliance and ethics, when at the same time a lot of what they're creating is to sort of move away from government regulation?
Yeah, just because they don't necessarily want the government involved, they still do want some clarity on what how the government perceives their given project or cryptocurrency or blockchain that they're on. So just simply having that clarity will go a long way and would be appreciated in the crypto world. And again, whether we actually end up complying or not is another thing, but we certainly welcome the clarity in different laws and regulations. In terms of ethics, that's that's something where we really want to take more ownership of and create a good framework that truly embodies the Web3 spirit that everyone can rely on. So right now, that's something that still, in my opinion, that still needs to very much be worked on. But a lot of people are open to it. A lot of people are open to having a sensible framework in place.
And I think just from my own research, what seems to be missing, especially from the government side, is some kind of guidance or olive branch to the Web3 community, sort of displaying or demonstrating what they want to see in terms of how Web3 companies are managing their affairs, right? What we've seen in the news is mostly very aggressive action, right, by the SEC and Department of Justice, for example, filing suits, trying to bring cryptocurrency, for example, under the control and regulation of SEC laws and regulations. But what seems to be missing is guidance, really from both sides, ultimately, right? The Web3 side needs to probably provide more guidance on what Web3 is, right, and what its principles are. but also from the government or the regulator side, there seems to be very little or no guidance offered on what they want to see or what their expectations are on how these companies are managed. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a problem when the only guidance you end up getting is through lawsuits, right? And through complaints, where finally there's some light on what they view as problematic, right? And a lot of companies, they've claimed to reach out to the SEC, for instance, to get that clarity, and they didn't get much of a response back, and then suddenly they're in trouble. But there are some examples where they they've created a sensible playbook, if you will. So Polkadot is one of them. Polkadot is partly affiliated with the Web3 Foundation, and the Web3 Foundation constantly has been in contact with the SEC throughout the entire creation of Polkadot. And it was very telling that Polkadot was not part of any of the recent complaints that have been filed. And they put out a tweet on sort of like what their process was in terms of that constant communication with the SEC actually willing to communicate back to them, and more so than that, their distributed treasury and type of governance that they ended up implementing. And so in a nutshell, it started off as a quote unquote security, but then became so distributed that you can no longer pin it to you can no longer pin the value of that blockchain to any centralized figure, so to speak. And so that's a possible guiding light, if you will, to sensible compliance going forward. But there definitely needs to be more clarity.
So we have a few minutes left. And I think the last thing I want to ask you is, despite some of the negative stories that we've heard related to crypto exchanges and the SEC's enforcement actions, why should we remain positive about what Web3 offers, not only from a business perspective, but also from an ethical standpoint?
It is all about self-custody, really, for me. And we should keep the spirit of Web3 alive, so to speak, simply for that, where you really should have that complete ownership of assets, and make sure that like there isn't that the type of manipulation that's common in Web 2. Apart from that, the technology around blockchain being a public ledger and the provenance and single sources of truth are really promising. And so you're seeing a lot of agricultural spaces, a lot of food sourcing, if you will, using the blockchain to kind of trace the chicken you buy all the way back to the original farm. And it's really good for things like that. It's really good for traceability. And as long as we just keep using the blockchain for provenance that benefits everybody and hold up to the ideals of Web3, then we'll be fine.
So, Warren, thanks so much for your insights today. Where can my listeners get more information about you and the companies that you're working with?
Yeah, so for Drip, that's dripgaming.io, and Vanities, that is vntys.com.
Excellent. Thanks, Warren, for your contributions today. And we look forward to hearing more insights in the future.
All right, appreciate it.